just like the other 6 are, and this is the 6th of the 7th. Philadelphia is oftentimes by scholars known as the Church of the Open Door. And I think you'll understand completely in just a moment why the biblical scholars call Philadelphia the Church of the Open Door. Now, that is based on something that is very, very applicable to the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, if you'll remember, again, kind of visual focus, they are on that eastern leg of the Roman postal road there in Asia Minor, what is today present-day Turkey. And Philadelphia is the second of those cities down the line. They are situated right in the middle of the other two. You got Laodicea to the south, you got Sardis to the north, and here's Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is fascinating because unlike most of those ancient cities, it was relatively new. It had only been around since 189 BC, and it was established by Pergamum. Now, we need to go back and review just a little bit about Pergamum because it's been several weeks since we studied the church at Pergamum and the city at Pergamum. If you'll remember, does anybody remember where Pergamum was located in relationship? It was the very northern leg of that western leg of the Roman postal road. There were 3 churches down to the south, and then there was Pergamum up here, right up at the northern part of the Aegean Sea. It was right across the Aegean Sea from the Grecian Peninsula. Now, does that jog any memories? Anybody remember anything at all about Pergamum? We talked about the fact its geographic location really influenced the city of Pergamum and the church. Do you remember upon what the economy was based?
Greek system. They had all it was just like they brought all the Greek culture over.
Perfect.
And reinstated it there, basically.
Perfect. It was a seafaring town. It was a port city, and you literally had the economy based on trade from literally all over the known Roman world at that time, particularly that Mediterranean area. The western part of the Roman Empire and the eastern part of the Roman Empire were kind of linked by the city of Pergamum. Not only did you have this Roman postal road, but you had a major trade route that went from the east to the west. And right in the middle of this is Pergamum. They were a wealthy city, a powerful city. If you remember, and that was a great point, they were a center of what we call Hellenism. When you hear Hellenism or Hellenistic, what does that mean? Greek. They were inundated with the Greek influence. The economy, the government, and religion. Do you remember we said in Pergamum there were 4 temples to 3 gods and 1 goddess there. And so there was everything focused on the Grecian history and the Grecian culture and the Grecian religion and the Grecian economy. Everything was built on Greek culture, and everything in their economy was built on trade. Now, if you'll think back, we've talked about the fact that there was a major problem that these folks in what is today Asia Minor or Turkey, that they faced, and it had the roots way, way, way back in the east, in the Mesopotamian Valley. What were they constantly fearful of? All these folks in the Eastern Roman Empire were constantly fearful of what? I'm sorry? Very good. Invasion. You remember a wild nomadic group that we call the Parthians? And we said they were ancestors of who today? The Iranians. And they exhibited a whole lot of the same traits. They were vicious, they were aggressive, they were expansionist. And these folks, they were the ones that we talked about were all rode the horses, the cavalry, and they struck fear into this part of the Roman Empire. And the problem is when you're economy and your culture is based on trade with the folks back to the east, what did these oftentimes constant invasions, even though they were sporadic and usually not widespread, what did these invasions or these vicious nomadic people, what did that do to your economy? Messed it up, yeah. Cut off the trade routes. Well, Pergamum, every time you had some of these people, whether it was the Parthians, or whether even before that it was Babylonians, and before that the Assyrians, they all came from the same area. And Pergamum said, we've got to do something to keep the trade routes open, or our economy is going to crash. So in 189 BC, they built Philadelphia. Established it literally out in the desert. They built this city. Philadelphia thrived because it was a stop from the east to the west, and the sole purpose that was established by the folks here in Pergamum was to make sure that you defend us and make sure the trade routes stay open. So Philadelphia was a bastion of military power, and when the Romans came in, they had a major military force there as well for the same exact reason. And if you'll think back, do you remember back in Pergamum? We said Pergamum had built up on top of a big old plateau, and they were pretty arrogant. They thought that they could not be defeated. But remember, we talked about the fact they were on several occasions. And the fact that Philadelphia is out here added to that sense of false security. And if you'll remember, the basic message that Jesus had for the folks there in Pergamum was, you better wake up. You better be aware of what's going on. You think that's a pretty relevant message for us today? Oh, I certainly feel that way. So here is this city out here, relatively new. Now, 200 plus years, nearly 300 years, is not new to us in our society, but it was in the societies of antiquity. Here is Philadelphia out here, and you're going to see that Jesus' message plays on this whole idea. Why do you think they call Philadelphia the open door city? Keep the door open from these invasions. Don't let this evil influence get in here and destroy our economy and destroy our culture and destroy our people. So the bottom line is that Philadelphia was the open door city, and Jesus is going to take that very same idea that you're going to see today, and you're going to understand more why he keeps using that word open door. And like I've told y'all before, to each of these 7 cities, everything he says symbolically and literally would resonate in those cities. They would understand it. So when he talks about open door, they understand what he's talking about, because that had been the whole reason that the city of Philadelphia was established 300 years before. Keep the door open to trade, and keep the door open where the barbarians, as they thought of them, cannot close the door to the economy or close the door to the Roman Empire. Now let's go ahead and start in verse 7 of chapter 3. And he starts exactly, this Jesus speaking of course, he starts exactly like he does to all 7 churches. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write. Now he's describing himself same way he's described himself back in chapter 1 as we talked about. To each of the different churches he uses a different description, a different metaphor if you will. But he says here, he who is holy, describing himself. What's the word holy mean? Separate, set apart, special. Why do you think that was an important concept to get across to these members of the Lord's body that are living in Philadelphia? Jesus is speaking and saying, I am separate, I am set apart, I am different. Because what we just said about Pergamum applied to Philadelphia. What do you think people from a religious point of view, to use that generic term, what was the problem that the influence that a lot of folks in the congregation at Philadelphia had? Very good. Lots of influence for the idolatry that was there. And in addition, and you might understand this, because in Philadelphia you had this major Roman military presence and this influence from back in Pergamum, it was a seat of the imperial cult as well. And we talked about before, what was the imperial cult? You worship whom as the true power and deity? The emperor. You worship the emperor. Jesus is saying here, I am the true God. I am the true Lord. I am separated from that. And look what he says. He continues, who is true? Who has the key of David? Now to the Jewish Christians, what did the name David mean? He was who? He was the king. He had the authority. He was the one that basically kept the nation of Israel alive and well and expanding and growing. You see, that's what Jesus is saying here. Now stop and think just a minute. I dare say that a whole lot of these Christians in Philadelphia were having a hard time with the issue and the question, how are we going to survive? How are we going to survive? Think about that. They're here in the middle of all this idolatry and all this materialism and this Roman occupation, and obviously because of all the influence from Pergamum, a whole lot of persecution. Very much unlike what we just talked about. They're persecuted, along with Smyrna, probably as much or more persecution as any of the other 7 churches. And yet, Jesus says you can grow and you can thrive. And we talked about last Sunday morning, why do God's people seem to thrive, as non-understandable as this may be? Why do God's people tend to thrive under persecution? I'm sorry? They're relying on God. And he's going to talk about this in just a minute. He's going to say, you don't have a whole lot of power, but you're going to not just survive, you're going to thrive. And it's because of that very fact. We'll get to that in just a moment. Good point, Kay. So here he is. He's introduced himself, and he's basically establishing the fact that you've got a source of power that even the Roman Empire can't stop. Then he goes on. He says, you are an open door. Do you see how that fits right in with the mindset in Philadelphia? You're an open door which no one can shut because you have a little power. Now, some Greek scholars say right here that a better translation than the NASB has right here, in spite of the fact that you have a little power. No one can shut the door. What door do you think he's talking about here? Perfect way to put it. The door of salvation. You know, it's just like when Pergamum established Philadelphia 300 years before, they said, you keep the door of a strong economy and keep the door of trade wide open, the key of our lifeblood in Pergamum, you keep it open. That's your job. Jesus says, you know what? You've got salvation. He's already promised to all the other churches that if you are faithful, you're going to continually have a door of salvation wide open. And if you notice what he said right there, he said, no one can shut it, only I can open it. And you have kept my word and have not denied my name. What does that mean? You're faithful. You can sum it up in that one word. You are if you are faithful, you cannot be denied the open door of salvation. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? And like I say, if we put ourselves in the place of these folks in Philadelphia, which we need to really understand what Jesus is saying, and then make application to us, he said, you can't lose if you are faithful. Is that good news? Is that good news? Oh, that's fantastic. We just talked about back in chapter 2 with Smyrna. Be faithful even unto death. and I'll give you Christ. You even have to lose your life, you're still a winner. Same application here to the church in Philadelphia. And then verse 9, there's some differentiated thought among some of the biblical scholars here. He says, behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Now, the difference in thought here, some Revelation scholars say he's talking about literal Jews. Now, throughout history of God and the relationship with his people, the Jewish nation, what was the significance of being a Jew? God's people, yeah. God's chosen people. God's people. And we've talked about those of you that have been in Cardin's class on Wednesday night. Boy, he's really hit hard on this. So, you know, there are a lot of people there in Rome, studying the book of Romans. There are a lot of people there in Rome that's Christian, Jewish Christians, that said, we've got a leg up over the Gentile Christians. Why? Because we're Jews. We don't have to do anything. We're Jews. Ethnicity is more important than anything else. And boy, Paul, did he rebuke that thought? Over and over and over again. And again, I know those of you that have been in Carter's class have had that concept drilled in. And it's still applicable today. Doesn't matter who you are, what ethnicity, what nationality. You're God's child. And that's what really matters. In fact, if you'll remember, Paul pointed out very clearly, he said, not what really matters is the physical. Neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, he says. Neither Jew or Greek. But what matters is what? Your heart. And your heart, with that's what he's saying right here. And some biblical scholars says he's talking about that some of these folks, these Jews, we know that the church throughout this first century and on, they were persecuted by Jews. Why? By many Jews. Yeah, there were a lot of people said, you can't, this isn't a real religion. You can't have Gentiles in it. You can't have Gentiles to be fake. And he also talks about, if you'll remember, even in the first century, earlier first century, when Paul comes back after that first missionary journey, there is a firestorm in Jerusalem, even among Jewish Christians. You cannot be baptizing Greeks. You cannot be baptizing Gentiles because they're not Jews. And what Jesus, some scholars are saying here, is just because they say they are God's people, they're not. Now others say that no, he's speaking symbolic here or metaphorically here, because we know, as we've already established in the city of Philadelphia, just like much of this area of Asia Minor, there are a lot of people that are steeped in idolatry. And they're paying homage. Well, there in Pergamum, we talked about there were 4 temples, one to Athena, one to Diana, one to Asclepius, to pronounce it correctly, and one to Zeus. And so there's a lot of people that are saying that's the real God. So we belong to God. God with a little g. But the bottom line is, he said, no. And when he used that word synagogue, what was a synagogue? Place of worship.
One of the things that they dislike the Christians, I'm talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. One of the big things, their power, their influence, vanishing. Christianity is coming up. That takes away their influence, their money, everything about it. This was one of the big things, and I think that's how it's.
I think it's an excellent point. That was one of the reasons that the Jewish hierarchy, if you want to use that term, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, Herodians, all those folks, they didn't like Christianity, because you phrased it very, very well. It was taking away their authority and their power. And Jesus has just said, all authority and power is vested in whom? By me. By me. And then, same thing can be said to those idolaters, that the real power, the real authority, the real key to being saved, as we just talked about, exists in me and not in something of this world. And he goes on here and uses a phrase in just a moment that talks about that we'll see throughout the Revelation. He says, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. I'll make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you. Do you think these folks had a hard time understanding that? The very people that are throwing them in prison, the very people that are trying to starve them and their families to death, the very people that belong to the most magnificent, widespread empire the world has ever seen, are going to come and bow down to us. Do you remember Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verses 9 and 10? Paul made a powerful, powerful statement. And on that day, every knee will what? Bow. And every tongue will confess that what? Jesus Christ is Lord. The very thing he's talking about right here. Now stop and think about that for a minute. Isn't that magnificent? That someday there will be no more debate, no more ambiguity. Jesus is Lord. And he's saying to these folks right now, you can be assured of that right now. Just like we can be assured of that right now. And so I love that statement that he makes there. He goes on, he says, and here's why. Verse 10. Because you have kept my word of my perseverance. What does that mean? What was Jesus' perseverance? Exactly. And you think about it, in your mind, can you focus on Jesus going up that rugged hill called Calvary and knowing he didn't have to do it? I mean, that has I indelibly etched in my mind a broken and bloody and battered body, even after the cross is taken off his shoulders. And he's laying there on that rugged cross, and those Roman soldiers are holding his hands and his feet down, and they're driving. Sometimes we talk about nails. They weren't. They were spikes into his hands. And he knew he did not have to persevere. He knew he didn't have to do it. Exactly. That's the Old Testament. That's straight from the Old Testament. He could have done it. And he knew it. And we know from a human perspective, you go back there just a few hours before in the garden, and he prayed to God, what? If anything can be done about this cup passes from me, what? Yeah, take it away. But I'm going to persevere and I'm going to do your will. Do you see the message to these Christians? I don't think there's any way in the world, we, in this society in which we live, I don't think there's any way in the world we can truly understand what these people were enduring. And I've made the statement several times in this class. I don't know about any of you, but I never feared for my life going to worship. I've never felt like that my livelihood was going to be jerked out from under my feet because I was a Christian. I've never done that. And I could cite you some gory stories about what's going on with these Christians right here. I mean, just horrible. If you ever get a chance, you really want to get a good picture, read the Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus talks about something in graphic detail. Now, he was very derogatory toward the Christians, but he tells stories, tells one that is etched in my mind about a Christian, and said, if you'll just renounce this Jesus Christo, as they call him, Jesus Christ, just renounce him. we'll let you go. If you don't, we're going to burn you at the stake. And he talks about this man in graphic detail, this Christian being burned at the stake, and through his shrieks of agony, singing praises to Jesus. And Tacitus is writing this letter that was preserved, they found. He's writing this letter to a friend, I believe this was in the 2nd century, that says, and I quote, "I have never seen such faith." Now, there's no evidence that Tacitus ever became a Christian, sadly. But do you think this unnamed martyr from 1900 years ago made an impact on Tacitus and who knows how many other people sitting there watching this barbaric spectacle? Yeah. And that's the perseverance that Jesus is talking about to the church at Philadelphia. That's the perseverance that he exhibited. That's the perseverance that the folks back in Pergamum, he talked about, wake up and understand what's going on. And so we see the message over and over and over again. He says, and here's another one of those things that scholars debate, "I also will keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world." Some people would say that this is judgment, the ultimate judgment. But many, many scholars, and I would concur with them, says he's not talking about the end of time. He's talking about, when he talks about will come upon the whole world, which is a phrase that you see quite often in Revelation. And when you see the whole world or people who dwell upon the earth or any phrase along that same line, he's generally talking about those people that are opposed to God or opposed to God's people. Now, just very quickly, Revelation can really be divided into 4 sections. Chapter 1 is just introduction, which we talked about that first week. Chapters 2 and 3 are the message Jesus has to the 7 churches, what we're in the midst of now. Then chapters 4 through 11, he talks about God's plan and gives you a picture of what's going to happen. And scholars say that is in what he calls cosmic terms. In other words, the big picture. And you can summarize that by saying good versus evil, righteousness versus sin, God versus Satan. Big, broad, generic concepts. And then in chapters 12 through 22, he tells the same story again, but this time it's more specific terms. It's more these first century Christians versus the Roman Empire. The world at that time versus those that are God's people. And so you've got the same story told twice in chapters 4 through 11 and chapters 12 through 22. It's fascinating the way he handles this. But what he's saying right now, and we've talked about this before, evil in this world, and that's going to be the message really throughout the rest of Revelation. Ultimately, evil in this world is going to be judged and it's going to be destroyed. And oftentimes it's going to happen before the end of time. How much longer was this seemingly omnipotent, impregnable empire called the Roman Empire? How much longer was it going to last? This is right at the end of the first century. Just a few hundred years more. Just a short, relatively in the scope of world history, a very short period of time. I mean, no one in the first century could have ever dreamed that within 400 years there is no Roman Empire. Let me ask you, where's the Roman Empire today? What's left of it? A few relics, a few ruins, some legacy, obviously, but there's nothing. The Roman Empire has no power anymore. Where are Christians today? We're still here, aren't we? We're all over the world, and the power of God is still omnipotent. That's what he's saying right here. I will keep you safe from the testing. You don't have to worry. I'm going to destroy evil. but I'm not going to destroy you. You're not just going, as I said a moment ago, survive. You're going to thrive. And you look back through history, and as a historian, I said over and over and over, you see evil come along, but evil has its term limit. But godliness doesn't. And we see that, and like I say, I mentioned that very first Sunday when we started studying Revelation. A lot of people are scared to death of Revelation. Oh, it shouldn't scare us. Man, it ought to buoy us in the most dreadful, trying times of our lives, because it's a guarantee you stay faithful. You put your faith in God, you put your trust in God, you are going to win. And as I said just a moment ago, he goes on, he has a statement that he made just up there. Let me see, let's go back and see. Verse 8, he says, I know you have but a little power, and you've kept my word, and you've not denied my name. And then it goes on, verses 9 and 10, but you're going to win. How much real worldly power does Greg Melton have? In a human sense, in a physical sense, in a material sense, I don't have much. Now, there's once upon a time, I thought I was 10 foot tall and bulletproof. I don't think that anymore. I don't think that, at least in the world. Probably the greatest blessing I ever had when I had that stroke was I realized I wasn't. And so I don't have a whole lot of power in that sense, but I've got a whole lot of power in a spiritual, godly sense. Why? Because I've got the Lord on my side. I've got the Lord on my side. And that's what he's talking about. He says, you know what? I'm going to give you a door that can be opened, and a door, salvation, that cannot be shut. And there's nobody, not the Roman Empire, not Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, not Joseph Stalin's Russia, not Xing or Ping or whatever his name is, China, not the worst evil in this whole society. It cannot be shut. And again, that's going to really resonate with these folks here in Philadelphia, because they know that's why their city was established. And you know what they also knew? They never could completely shut evil out. And eventually, Philadelphia and Pergamum, just like the Roman Empire, were going to be destroyed. But not the Christians. Those Christians, spiritually, are still alive and well and thriving, just like we will be. And then he goes on. He says, to test, in verse 10, to test those who dwell on the earth. Just to kind of file this way in the back of your mind. Every time, and you're going to see it a bunch throughout the rest of Revelation. He talks about those who dwell on the earth. That's always a synonym for those who oppose God and oppose his people. So anytime you see that, he said, dwell on the earth, are steeped in the things of this world instead of in godliness. And then he makes another statement that a lot of naysayers really come down. I am coming quickly. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one will take your crown. Now, a lot of people, a lot of doubters, would say, well, that's not right. That's 1900 years ago, and he hadn't come back. What do you think that Jesus was saying? I'm coming quickly. There's several schools of thought here. Yes, sir.
I think he's saying that I'll protect you right now.
Perfect. Chuck, I completely agree. We just talked about the fact, he's just told him, you don't have a whole lot of power, but you do, because I'm here, and I'm here right now. And others say, just what we just talked about, he's saying, you know what? I'm going to take care of the Roman Empire. I'm going to take care of it. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about this evil. Don't worry about the imperial cult. Don't worry about all this idolatry. I'll take care of it. You know, I hate to admit it, but there have been times I've just agonized. What can I do about this? You know, God's going to ask me to do the same thing that Jesus asked these folks right here. You just be faithful and do what I said, and I'll take care of the rest of it. There's an old friend of mine used to say, I do the little stuff and God does the heavy lifting. And I like that way. You know, God's going to take care of all this, and I'm going to do it, and I think Chuck's 100% right. I'm here right now. You've got help right now. And I'll keep coming as long as you're faithful. Then verse 12, again, one of those words that you see throughout Revelation. He who overcomes or endures or conquers or triumphs or remains faithful. Whole lot of very similar phrases. I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. What do you think that is? A pillar in the temple of my God. A strong, yes, exactly, very, very good. Do you think that pillars meant anything in temples, meant anything to these folks? Oh yeah, because every temple, we know there were several right here in Philadelphia, and we've already talked about there were 4 major temples back in Pergamum where this all established, and throughout all of these cities there were temples. And that's all about all that's left of the Roman Empire are these pillars in these former temples. What do those pillars look like today? They're ruins. They're cracked, they're fallen, they're partially there and partially not. People flock from all over the world to see the ruins of the Roman Empire. But Jesus says, I'll make you a vital part of the temple of whom? God. And we're going to get over, we're going to get here in chapter 4. In chapter 4, if you go out and study that, or throughout really the end of Revelation, you see these spectacular scenes of heaven. There are not any ruins in heaven. There's not any dilapidated buildings in heaven or rock quarries in heaven. And that's what he's saying right here. I'm going to make you something permanent here. And he talked about the same thing he said to Smyrna. No one will take your crown. He who overcomes, I'll make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will not go out from it any more. And I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. Now think way back several weeks ago when we talked about Pergamum. In Pergamum, he talked about the fact you're going to have a new name. And we talked about the significance of God and new names. We looked at some very well-known examples. When Abram became Abraham, God in Hebrew, Abram meant the father, the exalted father. Abraham meant the father of many nations or many people or many generations. And Sarah, his wife, Sarai meant one thing. Sarah meant the princess of God's people. The whole thing, God throughout history has said names are important. And do you remember in Pergamum, the new name? What was the new name in Pergamum? Christian. Before, Jews were there, and of course these folks in Philadelphia and throughout the ancient world had lots of different names. But he said the important name, and I think that's what is vital for us to understand, the important name that is ascribed to us, you are a Christian. And if you are a Christian, a true follower of Jesus Christ, you're guaranteed victory. And then, I'm trying to hurry because we're just about time. The New Jerusalem, what was the significance of Jerusalem, particularly to the Jewish Christians? It's where the temple was, where the worship was, and where God what? Dwelled on earth. Now, think about this, and we know from our New Testament stuff, now, who's going to dwell with God for all eternity? Under the Mosaic law, only the priest could go into the Holy of Holies, but now God's presence is available to all. So that's what he's talking about in the New Jerusalem here, which comes down out of heaven from my God and my new name. And then verse 13, he ends it just like he does to all the 7 churches. He who has an ear, let him hear. Pay attention, Jesus says. Any quick questions? Yes, sir.
You ask a person, are you a Christian? And they say, no, I'm not. If they say, no, I'm not a Christian, but I'm a Catholic, would be an example. How they can give up the name Christian? Just, it's true, they know the difference between the universal church and Jesus Christ.
Right.
Anyway, that's all.
That's a good comment. Good comment. And I agree with you. I don't understand. I really don't. Anything else? Yes, sir.
While ago when we were talking about persecution and how it's so bad there and not here. But as I read, and I did read about on that years ago, on persecution around the world, Indonesia, China, they have done the very same thing. You mentioned burning and stake. They wrap Christians over there in ties, then set them on fire while they were alive. They take them alive in baskets, dip them in water, let them drown, set them on fire. So that people there have had great persecution compared to what we have here.
Oh, yeah. It's widespread through many places. Like I've told you, we support a missionary in India, and he had the scars to prove what had happened to him. So anyway, thank you very much. Lord willing, next Sunday morning we'll look at Laodicea, the last of the 7 churches Jesus spoke to.